They want to regain the sovereign borders of Ukraine, including Crimea. And I think that the chances are, I would put money on them achieving that, probably at least being able to invest northern Crimea by about late spring next year. Well, the onslaught continues on Ukrainian cities, power supplies, power stations, and we're all with the intent of breaking the morale of the civil population by this attack of missiles. I mean, I think we've seen something like yesterday, something like 70 missiles incoming, of which notably the Ukrainians shot down 50. So, they're doing really well, but
Yes.
it's causing immense destruction and suffering and casualties. And knocking out heating and light and at a time like this when it's not getting terribly cold here, but it is getting cold in Ukraine. So this is bad news for the Ukrainians. But if Putin thinks it's going to break civilian morale, he's got it badly wrong because it's
Yes.
not.
What do you reckon, Richard, the objectives of the Ukrainian military are now? Before we get into the winter and the pace of the fighting slows down, do you think there is a particular aim, or is it just a question of pushing the Russian lines back as far as possible?
No, the Ukrainian aim is very simple: to kick out, to regain every ounce, every centimeter of Ukrainian territory, and make sure there are no Russians on it. So they want to regain the sovereign borders of Ukraine, including Crimea. And I think that the chances are, I would put money on them achieving that, probably at least being able to invest northern Crimea by about late spring next year.
Yeah.
We're seeing a slowdown now, of course. The weather has been wet, it's muddy as hell, its movement is difficult, and the fighting goes on. But I think as the winter goes on, as the weather gets colder and the ground gets harder, I think we could see the Ukrainians begin to move rather more quickly.
Yeah, I mean, which begs the question: if we're talking about Ukraine taking significant parts of Crimea back from Russian control, where does Russia go from here? Because it's impossible to imagine a point where Putin would ever say, or maybe even think, "Look, it hasn't been worth it for Putin. It's been a disastrous mistake." He's not going to say that to himself, still less to the Russian people, surely.
Yeah, Putin has lost this war, and it's going to take time for the penny to drop. Um, but I think that where does Russia go? I think downhill all the way. I think that Putin's position is going to become increasingly in jeopardy. I think the stresses and strains on Russia, on the Russian Federation, as Putin is seen increasingly to be defeated, loses face massively, are going to be really significant. And again, I wouldn't put it too far out of the realms of possibility to say that frankly, the Russian Federation could come apart at the seams over the next maybe 5 years or so.
Well, obviously that's a fascinating thought. I mean, close to the ground and very immediately. I was looking at a report today that the Russians, whose manpower, as we know, are under a great deal of pressure, are looking at using the available resources that they have by way of elite fighters. The VDV Airborne is the unit that I saw mentioned in particular, elite paratroopers. They were, after the retreat from Kherson, being thrown into the Donbass battle. On the ground, Richard, tell me the difference that sort of thing will make.
I saw that report as well. It to me it sounds as if they're plugging gaps as urgently as they possibly can. But bear in mind that that force will have been severely written down. It might be one of the better units or elements of the Russian army, but over the last 9 months, it will have been written down significantly in terms of casualties and equipment loss. And then to put light forces, and I don't know, put light forces in on the ground, they can really only do so much. So I think all this amounts to the fact that the Russians are extremely stretched. They're running out of troops of any capability. They're plugging gaps with the Mobics, the so-called Mobics, these mobilized large numbers who've been scooped off the streets indiscriminately, chucked into the firing line with no training, with ancient equipment, even if they've got it. And their morale is very shaky, to say the least. And
Mm.
so I think all this amounts to the Russian army increasingly on the back foot.
All right. Now the war takes many forms, doesn't it? And my eye was really caught by the reports of the Ukrainian intelligence security services cracking down on Russian Orthodox monasteries and seeing them as part of the Russian effort, maybe for the stashing of money and Russians in those places. Just put that into some context for me. To what extent and how could these Orthodox Russian monasteries pose a threat to Ukrainian security and to the war effort?
Well, let's be clear, the Russians will be using every means they can to undermine the integrity of the Ukrainian state, to destabilize it. They'll be certainly continuing to target President Zelensky and other senior Ukrainian leaders. And they'll be using every means at that disposal, whether through cyber, through special forces, and however far-fetched it might sound, through potential fifth columnists. And it may be, I suspect, that the Ukrainians have got their suspicions. I saw that report as well. And it's quite right that the Ukrainians take whatever action they can to maintain security, because that is their center of gravity, their source of strength. And if the Russians manage to get through any chink in the armor, that could cause the Ukrainian state damage. And so it's quite right that they should look, the Ukrainian security services should be looking very carefully to take action against any organization who might destabilize the state.